So welcome to Terrascope's second Climate Cafe. We're extremely privileged to have an incredible council today. So for those who don't know, Climate Cafes are really a fireside chat series with our whole Terrascope team. We talk about everything that's related to what we do. We talk about climate tech, machine learning, data science, and sustainability, and the intersection of all of those tenets. Terrascope has this amazing Women Power Sustainability Advisory Council, and we're really thrilled to welcome you in person to Singapore. So you've come in from around the world. I would love to start with you, Mari Kogiso. If please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you.
So hello everyone. Really great to be here, and so honored to be this part of this esteemed advisory panel and all woman power. It's really great. So I've been currently I'm running a company called SDG Impact Japan, and what it does is basically we run a few funds on sustainable tech. So we have agri-food tech, sustainable venture fund, and also we are now developing circular economy, venture fund together with some outside VCs. And we also launched SDG 9, SFDR 9 aligned ESG engagement fund, which was the first thing in Japan last year. And it has been doing so well. And so those work that we have been doing for the last 2 years in Japan. And before that, I was working for fast retailing. Well, it's a fast fashion company, but it was so, I decided to join to really see how it works from inside. So I was there as a global head of diversity and human rights for 2 years. And before that, I was working in a foundation called Sasagawa Peace and developed the first gender lens investing fund in Japan, because I see that gender issue is quite huge issues, especially in Asia and Japan. And it has a very deep link with environment or social related issues. So I'm really looking at that as I've been advising some Japanese company on gender. And other than that, before that, I was working in the World Bank. So I have a long history because I'm getting old. But before that, I was working in the World Bank in Washington, D.C. and Tokyo, and developing infrastructure project and all others. So very nice to meet everyone. Looking forward to talking today.
Thank you, Mari. Wonderful. And Karen Coyne, ESG veteran, please tell us a little bit about your background.
Thank you, Leah. It's a pleasure to be here today with everybody and all of the terrors in the room. So I live in the United States and live outside of Boston. My career has been, as Leah alluded to, 30 years doing ESG, what's now called ESG, and under a convenient umbrella, covering a lot of topics. But my specialty has been around sustainability, and specifically working at the intersection of business from the corporate perspective as well as science. So I trained as a scientist, found I really love business too, and said, well, I'll just work at that intersection. So the first part of my career was doing consulting and management consulting to corporates, mostly US multinationals as they expanded overseas. And then later on to foreign multinationals as they came to the United States. And so thinking about those large global issues, compliance regulations, how do you manage, how do you get a standard that a whole corporation can belong to or adhere to? And then did a few other things. And then my last role was not consulting to a multinational, but actually working in one as in the environmental health and safety and business continuity function. And my last role was as the global head of environment, where I had the privilege of setting up a new structure for the environmental and sustainability function. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but it was a gift of a role, a once in a career opportunity. So I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. And last but certainly not least, I have the pleasure to introduce Claire Perry-O'Neill.
Thank you. Well, first of all, great to be here the anniversary week. And it was wonderful to cuddle with some of you on whatever night it was, Monday, Tuesday. I've lost track. By the way, so I'm a geographer who had a business career, and as a geographer, I've been puzzling over the terra tectonics thing. I think terratonics could be better. So just FYI. So I was a geographer who went into business, who then kind of accidentally strayed into politics in the UK and ended up having been Minister for Railways, which was a great job, in my dream job, which was Minister for basically climate, clean growth and energy, which was a cabinet position. And it was that perfect time before Brexit had really started to bite, before we'd had the great COVID shock and the Ukraine energy price shock, where we really had good agreement on what we needed to do in the UK, and we had the Paris Agreement as a sort of guiding force for our landing zones. So as you said, we passed the net zero legislation, but we also worked out very quickly that governments don't change things on their own, and we really needed private sector involvement and a whole buy-in to this process. And so we did a lot of good public-private partnerships, which I think are very relevant. I left politics in 2020, having brought the COP to the UK and done some action planning for that. Went to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, a great business-led NGO that's been around for almost 30 years. Novartis was an amazing member, you know it well. Then led the programme there for a couple of years and now co-chair their global advisory board along with the CEO of OLAP, very well known to us, of course, as the Terrascope parent company, and have a number of board and advisory roles in a global portfolio that's energy, climate and sustainable investing.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, today's Climate Cafe, initially it was going to be climate disclosure, but that felt from having some conversations, it's really all about the transition and future forward. So the pivot to focus today is actually on transition planning, and I think it's something that really resonates with what we do as Terrascope. We're looking at historical data, we're presenting that and sharing that with C-suite in companies and management at all levels, and looking at what does that mean from a carbon emissions and a financial perspective for the future. Transition plans are a key bridge for the past and that net zero 1.5 aligned future. So we've got a investor perspective, kind of a corporate perspective, and really a public policy perspective coming together around transition planning and what's the road ahead. So two key questions is, what is a transition plan? And second, what makes a transition plan credible? And Claire, I'd love to start with one thing that you said this week, which really resonated with me, is the road ahead. We're looking at a transition that is at the scale of the Industrial Revolution, at the speed of the digital transformation. And so when we look at what's coming up from a net zero perspective, and the UK has actually made transition plan mandatory from a publicly listed company perspective, what is a transition plan supposed to help achieve?
So it's a really good question, and so let me start by answering by saying I think we have made a fetish of planning without really knowing all of the variables, and so there is a challenge with planning, because imagine if we had tried to plan the first industrial revolution. Imagine if a bunch of politicians had sat around and said, well, we're going to bring in coal, and we might have a few more coal miners, and we might have a few less farmers, but we've got this plan, and everything would have been wrong. Imagine if we tried to plan the growth of the internet back in 1996 when I first became cognizant of this thing. Everything we knew would be wrong. So in a way, trying to plan an entirely global, into whole of economy transformation is a bit of a sort of you can't do this, it's utterly impossible. On the other hand, we know the landing zone, which we didn't know for economic growth or digital penetration. We have this landing zone for emissions, and the emissions challenge actually is quite simple. We just need to get on, global emissions minus emissions removal down to zero, and wherever it intersects the timeline basically gives you, according to the models, a temperature outcome. So there is a mathematical solution here. So I think it's very helpful to have plans and to include both, what will happen, let's take it at the company level, what will happen to your current businesses, what are the growth and risk opportunities, what does that mean for your investors, and what does that mean for your staff and also your whole supply chain. So there's definitely huge value in working this out. And this is where I think Terrascope is so incredibly valuable, because one of the most powerful things I've seen this week is with one of the clients in Europe, which is the what if scenario. So if you're thinking about how do you get into, you know sustainable building materials is a thing. You can see that there are actually price premiums emerging for that. But you actually have no idea how to bring that into your planning and to say, what if we invested in X? And by the way, what would the cost of that be? So we have to take this kind of, very worthy concept of a plan right down to a business operational level, because ultimately businesses are there to invest other people's money and generate a return and to have a wonderful impact on their employees and the environment. I find government planning is, in certain economies, Singapore I think is probably an honourable exception, is also a bit of a fool's exercise, partly because the average duration of a Prime Minister is half that of a CEO. And in the UK, one of them got outlasted by a lettuce, for God's sake. What could possibly be the plan after that? And so there's a lot of talk about planning, but in many, particularly Western economies, those plans don't stand the test of time. So again, I don't think we should make a fetish of transition planning. I think it's incredibly helpful, but actually the more you can bring it down to operational decisions, what am I going to do with my capital over the next 5 years? And what will the return be? And how can I then tell my investors that I might cut the dividend over the next 2 years, but the stock price over the long term will be worth much more? So again, we talk a lot about this in this, my view is we have way too much rhetoric and not enough reality in the world. Let's not talk about it in rhetorical terms. Let's make it actual living operational plans that we can adjust and work with.
Wonderful. Spoken like a true pragmatist. True
I am
true to
on my t-shirt. No rhetoric, more pragmatism.
And it's really, as you're saying, it's about the journey, the conversations that you have and who you involve, rather than the plan as an outcome. And so that process being really crucial. And I'd love to hear from your perspective of kind of anything that is new is built on something old. And so what is the transition plan might be a new term, but what has transition planning looked like through your own experience, Karen?
Yeah, and thanks. And another great question. And I love the landing zone reference. So we know where we're going, but how are we going to get to that landing zone, right?
Let's not pretend we know.
Exactly. Exactly. So, to speak to some or give some examples based on my experience, both my last role at Novartis, but also the 20 plus years working with multinationals, because certainly these big system-wide issues have been around for a while, and corporates have been working on this, starting with environmental management systems like ISO 14001, and Toyota was a client of mine, worked with them on that. So thinking in big picture systems things have been really the foundation, I think, that have serving corporates well right now if they've taken that journey, because they have this plan, do, check, act mentality, and how to work with things like an environmental management system where you're trying to manage air quality, water quality, maybe hazardous waste. You can't necessarily see it and feel it, but it's there. And so you're trying to manage the invisible and manage things that are sneaking up behind you and don't know that it's going to affect the company. So that systems thinking has been the foundation that has served a number of corporates well. Where we are today is that thinking being matured, that thinking going beyond the corporate fence line. Before it, historically, the foundation was we'll get our house in order, we'll be in compliance, we'll meet some procurement standards if we're sourcing to somebody else. But now that shift has really been, we rely on that, but we have to reach out to our stakeholders. Shareholders, yes, but key stakeholders as well. So that communication and collaboration and reaching out. Companies now setting their carbon neutral and net zero goals, and it's a huge daunting task, and we don't know how to do it, but some of the attempts have been, let's set a target, and how are we going to do this? Some of the approaches have been, well, let's break it down. We'll take a target and we'll set some metrics around it. So one target may have 5 or 6 metrics, how we're going to measure our progress, and then we're going to brainstorm a lot of projects that will help us measure ourselves through the metrics to get to that target. And essentially, it's an enormously complex situation, just thinking of one climate target alone. So it gets broken down into little bits, like a lot of things. Well, You maybe take a project management office approach, a PMO approach, and you, for each of these projects that you want to undertake and invest in, you look at what are the work streams, which ones are very operational, and I'd say those are the ones that get prioritized because it's down at the ground in operations, as you refer to, really making progress. Some are strategic and more business process oriented, such as can we put environmental sustainability references or requirements in our procurement forms with our suppliers and make that a mandatory normal business process that just gets integrated in and it makes it happen. But looking at all those work streams and breaking them down and forming teams, sending them out to a number of sites, and then having some sort of oversight or governance of it, both at a functional level, like the global environment team or sustainability team, and in the management, the C-suite and the board. Because get all this going on the ground, and we want to make sure that we're all coordinated. You want to have some be, think globally, act locally, but at some point there has to be some sort of governance and oversight. So it's enormously complex, and that's just one target. And so then you multiply by 10 or 15, and then the reporting around it, and I know we'll get to that topic a little bit later in the disclosure, but it just really starts with systems thinking, working with key stakeholders, working with WBCSD and other good alliances like that to collectively try to solve this, because no one company, we all have to do this. Like
embedded in that kind of internal
embedded in it, make it part of
participatory.
what natural, normal business processes.
Did that take, is that like a 6-month or was that multi-year process?
It's
what you're describing?
To get things off the ground, as any new initiative, it gets a lot of horsepower behind it, and then it needs, and all the adrenaline around it, and then it naturally, to be successful, needs to then get to a steady state where people are productive and effective, but not, making sure. So it needs to go to steady state, but you definitely, and there, what's difficult is that there are bumps in the road and things don't go well. And then you've got to regroup, do it again. And so then the mantra usually is, we'll celebrate small successes and then we'll get through this, and don't be so overwhelmed by the sheer enormity of the task.
Wonderful, thank you. And Mari, so from the kind of finance sector, there has been some momentum in the finance institutions to look at what do transition plans and real economy companies that are actually moving the goods around the world and that are exposed. So what makes a transition plan credible from an investor perspective? What do you look for?
Yes. I think there was just Coyne and everyone just said, like it's extremely complex task that the company have to go through, and for investors, it's probably sometimes more complex because investors have to understand. Sometimes they don't know the nature of each business of the companies that they are investing in, but they have to also they have to look at the kind of short-term profit, right? We are scrutinize how much money, especially asset managers, will be pushed, that what's the performance that they are getting. So it tends to be a little bit like shorter termism, that mindset is always there. So how we can change to the little bit longer term mindset is really needed for both companies and the investors. But since investors tend to really put more focus on shorter term profit, I think the company have to have the really the strategy and logic to really persuade investor that how those ESG will turn into the profit in the longer term. So it's of course company have to talk about the impact, but right now investors are still looking at so-called single materiality, how ESG factors really affect the company's profit in the longer term. So I think that companies have to persuade investors why it will pay off. And also, of course, there's a deeper discussion that if it's okay, if it's okay not talk about impact. But unfortunately, right now in the financial sector, still impact discussion is not very prevalent, unfortunately. But it has to be there in the longer term, long future. I think that discussion need to come in, but it's still being discussed in not the mainstream yet, but it should come to mainstream. But I think what need to corporation to do is really put a link between ESG and the profit, how the ESG and the profit should connect. So that's something that investor cannot really know from looking at the numbers. So the corporation have to really, it's a lot of uncertainty, I know, but at least make a logical and very clear explanation that why they think it will turn into the profit in the medium to longer term and strong enough to persuade investors.
Mm-hmm. And so this is specifically the Japan market?
Yeah, I think the situation a bit different in Europe and in the US, but in Japan and looking at some Asia, I think that's still the situation. Yeah.
I'm not sure it is different in Europe. I mean, there was the classic example just a few months ago where BP, who've been very much in the lead in terms of they're transitioning their business model, have seen their share price been hammered, and they basically announced that they were going to slow the rate of oil production decrease, if that makes sense, and their share price went up 10% in a day. Yeah. So for all the rhetoric, as a director, it's really difficult because you're still feeding the dividend machine, right? The EPS and dividend machine. And so, and for all investors say, oh no, we're definitely committed to net zero. They're really not. They're all looking for returns. And it is true that more sustainable businesses generate higher returns. But I think that, I don't know whether that's correlation or causality. Personally, I'm not sure.
Lots of people talking about those correlation, but unfortunately, it not really have been proved yet. Yeah, so I think so. So discussion should be only profit, not only profit, but also impact. But for impact side, I think the government or someone more outside pressure have to come in and incorporate. Should make more effort, to think about how they can make profit out of all sustainability.
Oh, we were talking last night at the CFO network, again, sorry to plug WBCSD, fine organisation. Surely we ought to be able to do carbon price adjusted EBITDAs and WACCs. Surely we ought to be able to analyse the finances. And the problem is, that's an interesting theoretical exercise, but if there is no carbon pricing in your country and you start adjusting, and of course everyone says we should have a global carbon price, that's just not going to happen on a compliance basis. You might have a G20 minimum carbon price threshold, which I think is a sort of good idea, but so it's tough, but it doesn't mean we can't. I mean, ultimately, the fact that we're approaching planetary boundaries will have a huge impact on everyone's business model.
And hopefully it won't take the enforcement angle, right? We're seeing more private litigation, and the costs are starting, because, I mean, when you get 21 billion in one country in one flooding event, that circle starts to come through. So transition planning, I guess, is a really important kind of future scenario preparation. So I'd love to open up for Terrascope to have this opportunity to ask questions to our really incredible council member here. So, Johan, I see you looking front row. This is the risk.
Okay, perhaps a bit of a long-winded question, but one thing that's been on my mind is there may be some companies and some countries that take the lead on, and Claire, this is very much to your point, that may take the lead on trying to mitigate their emissions. But if you take a step back, right? Like you mentioned, you still have traditional forms of energy like coal and whatnot that are actually doing quite well. And for all the efforts that some companies and countries might take in reducing their emissions, what would it take for emissions at large to actually still decline, right? How do you actually get those, the players that are unwilling to move or that are maybe benefiting from the efforts of others? How do you, as a planet overall, how do you think we might still be able to make that transition to get everything on a net level aggregate level down? It's just some open-ended question.
So it's a great question, right? Because people have made a ton of money in coal, for example. And for me, look, so there's a great quote which is ascribed to Nelson Mandela, although I don't think it's his, which is, "How do you eat an elephant? One slice at a time." Sorry for all the vegans and vegetarians in the room, not my quote. But when you've got a problem that is so huge, there is no one solution. Just stop oil, bye-bye plastics, bye-bye COVID solutions, right? These are absurdly simplistic things that people say, but it doesn't mean you can't. You have to start somewhere. And I think the good news is, I personally think emissions are at the peak. I mean, there is we are now reaching tipping point in renewable energy at source cost, not delivery cost, because we haven't dealt with the grid problem, with EV penetration. Which are the two huge buckets. I think we've got this consciousness raising, particularly at the corporate sector now, which means we've got enormous industrial strategy coming out of China, the US and Europe. So it feels to me that we're right at the top of that parabola. It doesn't mean people won't make a ton of money in declining industries going forward. And I think we just need to accept that. I'm sure people made a bunch of money still making horse buggies as vehicles ICE vehicles took to the roads. The challenge with coal is a very specific one. We set up a thing called the Powering Past Coal Alliance globally in 2017 between the UK and Canada, because if we just did one thing in the energy system, it would be to get off coal. I personally don't care, truthfully, whether we bring on gas or nuclear or a package of renewables, because anything we did would drop emissions by 50% compared to the existing, and would massively improve air quality and quality of life in urban areas. The challenge with that is most of our systems, particularly in Southeast Asia, are coal-based, and so they have quite new coal plants. So we have to invest, and so there's been really interesting creative approaches. DBS Bank's been involved, where we've said, okay, Indonesia, what's it going to take, and how do we help you, and how do we buy those coal plants and retire them early? So there's a lot of creativity in the mix now around the coal issue, and I think that's really positive. But I go back to this point that you can't just wish away these problems. You have to slice them up, and also every country has to have a different lens. And of course, there's 1 billion people in the world who have no access to electricity at all, and those economies are largely powered by women and little girls collecting biomass to burn as charcoal. They would love a bit of coal-fired power. We have to think about that. Again, this transition to me also involves making sure we have equity in the existing distribution of our energy system. Sorry, I'm afraid there's no silver bullet, but it doesn't mean we can't slice up the aubergine. Let's change the analogy to more user-friendly. Sorry about that, not my quote.
I like the vegetable analogy, certainly. And I think, did you have a follow-up? No, you're just holding it very active. Yeah, we'll open up. I think also the role that we play with the corporates to understand what is their coal exposure. So actually by looking at supply chains and looking at scope 3, then you start to shift that awareness, not from a theoretical, the world needs to get off coal, but actually this was contributing to my emissions by this percent. Let me think about how I engage the government in Indonesia and lend a voice of support. So I think the ability to quantify is very good point.
I think as an investor, when we look at the coal issue, of course we check how they're mitigating coal use, right? But also since coal companies are making tons of money right now, so what we look is they are making the right investment out of this profit. So they are especially investing in a new project or a new technology. Because if you look at the coal, there's a bunch of means to reduce their emissions, and a very simple one could even work in developing countries. So how to bring these even simple technology and increase efficiency, or avoiding high emission coal plant. But there's tons of things that can be easier to reach, but still there need a system, probably bigger system, to really help those developing countries, especially still growing with new technology on a bigger level.
Thank you, Mari. I think we've got another question. I almost forgot I was the moderator for a second. Started chiming in. So QQ, please.
Hi, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I really like the notion that action plan doesn't mean that we have figured everything out, right? Like it's something to align everybody, like where we're going forward. But I'm wondering, like in the process of making an action plan, what are some of the things that makes it really good to, in the implementation phase, to make sure it will actually get implemented and will make a good impact?
Would you like to take that one, Karen?
So it references back a little bit to what I was speaking about earlier, where breaking things down, having an action plan, and I think from an implementation standpoint, integrating it into the regular activities of the company and everybody having a role was what we found effective, because ownership, care, commitment, energy goes to employees saying, I'm having a part of this really big problem and I'm making a difference. I may feel overwhelmed at home when I think about these large global issues, but I know at work, in addition to my normal role, that I'm doing something, maybe seems small at the point in time, but if they are contributing with other employees and they've got a role in it. And that approach we found worked really well. So it's this combination of the top-down resources, upskilling, competency building, and then from the employee level up, small, say for example, green teams getting together at different campuses and saying, our campus in this country, this location wants to do this particular environmental project, getting the local executive sponsor to provide some resources and time off of their normal job. But they feel very rewarded by it and feel like they have a role to play, and then become proud of it. And then we've had past experiences with different companies where then these employees get so jazzed up about it, their kids get jazzed up about it and aren't really sad about the whole climate situation, and they get invited to go to the local school system and start talking about it. And then it just becomes this, like throwing a pebble in a pond, and these just circles of action and energy and involvement and having sort of skin in the game, as it says. So that really helps from the action plan standpoint. And it's just simple things like that don't take a lot of resources. It's just planning and organization around it to make it happen.
Karen, may I ask a question? How often would you report back on the plan? And because it's a dynamic implementation, presumably matters in the fast.
So a number of companies, and including the last company I was with, we had to have a governance steering committee of executives, and that would meet once a month to talk about what was happening. And then through normal business operations internally in terms of reporting and meetings, adding this topic as a regular agenda item, and then rolling it up once a month to report to a steering committee that could help weigh in and give some opinions, as well as help where there were resource blocks where implementation may have been stuck for a particular reason, and was it a resource issue, help with the getting at the root of it. So I'd say quite often, and I'd say that was my experience in consulting with other companies as well, because then it keeps it at the top of mind for everybody. And it's amazing to see how it starts becoming a normal part of conversation versus an agenda item at a particular quarterly or monthly meeting that, oh, I need to read about this in my PowerPoint deck before I get there. It just becomes conversational and becomes normalized. So.
And you spoke a little bit about those metrics and breaking them down. And I know we've spoken about kind of integrating those into the kind of company KPI at different levels. How did that process go? Was that fairly easy? Was that a hard process to do? Was that important for the implementation?
Absolutely important, because that, as that saying goes, about measuring what you're working on and managing it. I think having those KPIs also integrated in with performance metrics, performance management from an employee management standpoint, having it part of annual objectives, integrated into that process as well. Integrated in through, we talked about the suppliers through the procurement process, having those metrics integrated in through capital authorization requests, CAR requests for funding for projects. So, but in the appropriate form for the appropriate process. So it's really taking the environmental metrics of how we're going to march towards the carbon commitments, and then breaking it down and tweaking it so that it's relevant to the process or the activity or work stream or action plan that's being worked on. And so it gets sprinkled throughout and collectively rolls up to what we're trying to achieve.
And is there, from the investor perspective, kind of on that thread of following up on plans and that accountability, I'm assuming you play a key role in looking that plans get implemented?
Yeah, of course, like we look at, of course, you know, the implementation, if it translates into numbers, that's the best, but then we also look at the process. And it doesn't come out if we just look at number. That's why the engagement is important. And I think many financial institutions engage with the companies right now. And in those conversations, we ask that how they're implementing it. But actually, like, company side always ask us back, like, oh, you know, our sustainability division is trying so hard to implement this, but other divisions are not really caring about that. And the situation is a bit changing because there's a more thinking about like product life cycle, like how that make whole product more sustainable, right? But still in the corporation, like getting like everybody at the same page is very hard. So I think getting remuneration like system would be very important, and having a leadership talk about that all the time is really important. And also there is a question like, what if I get the boss who doesn't care about like environment, right? But if the company itself have a right mission and, you know, like so-called like purpose, I think that's going to be really important.
Interesting. So how much part of the DNA of the company is it if there's leadership change?
It's a holistic culture as well.
Culture, yeah.
I mean, it's mindset, but it's also just culture. And the role that culture, something as soft as you think, is culture really just how it can be as an enabler, corporate culture being purpose-driven as in addition to being profit-driven, really can help be an enabler to make gigantic things happen. So.
And that works at the political level as well, right?
Yeah.
Political leadership.
Yeah, no.
No?
Actually.
Okay, let me hear it.
because, and I'm thinking as you're saying that, and I agree, but also, you know, the compensation question is really difficult because ultimately you want to pay your staff in line with their peers, and if their peers are working for coal companies and being paid a fortune, then it's a problem. And you know, and there are a couple of very important CEOs who've led very purpose-driven companies in. I'm thinking one in Latin America and one in Europe who are both leaving their posts a little early, perhaps because they perhaps prioritise purpose over returns, and so it's a problem, right? In an asymmetric world, that so there is something perhaps about balance. I don't think that. I think there are very few purpose-driven political leaders in the world, and again, there are different ecosystems in Southeast Asia, which I'm sort of learning. This very strong compact between government and citizens and businesses you see in Singapore is most unusual. I think in most of Western democracies, and certainly in the US, the currency is votes, and unfortunately people vote. You know, I don't think so. Allegedly, climate concern is at the highest it's ever been in the UK. And I think 90% of people voted in the last election based on their view of Brexit. So much as we have these long-term ambitions, ultimately politicians, they just deal in votes, and they deal in 4-year cycles, and long-term careful shifts in behaviour, not necessarily thinking, and purpose for your country, it doesn't really work on the doorstep, in my experience, very rarely. And the Green Party, again, is doing very well in certain countries in Europe. It's got a record, well, actually, you know, it's in the last national election, a record low number of votes in the UK, not a record low. So sadly, again, I think, you know, purpose is something we might like to talk about in politics, but doesn't happen. But I always go back, you know, if you think about, and again, there were purpose-driven companies 200 years ago. I mean, you know, Hershey, You know, Foxes, Cadbury's. There were companies who, partly because they were Quakers and they didn't want to invest in slavery and guns, so what was left, it was food, right? So you had this companies who were extraordinarily purposeful, both in their approach and their working conditions, and were utter leaders in workforce empowerment and engagement. So I think there is a lot of lessons to be learnt from that. And I actually think I think you said this, Leah, that people want to come to work, or maybe just Karen, feeling they're part of something. And actually, businesses, particularly local businesses, are the most trusted entity in any hierarchy when you ask citizens, you know, with often politicians being the least trusted. So again, of course you need government to set guardrails, and of course you need these big things, but I don't think people particularly trust their politicians to do the right thing. And certainly laws can be unbroken. Somebody could repeal the net zero legislation if they wanted to, and if they got majority in Parliament, they will. They could.
Dose of realism.
They will. Sorry, I'm afraid I'm scarred by many years.
But given that, and I think, so what makes a transition plan credible? Because you have thought about the future, you've plotted out a path, and you thought, how do we sell this? And I'm thinking the Inflation Reduction Act is not called the Climate Change Act, right?
No, but that's a brilliant, incredible. So that's why it's got really strong bipartisan support. So it's a total winner, because you have climate change deniers in Texas putting up huge wind farms on their land and putting in a giant EV charging network. And the IRA Act will drop America's emissions by 10 percentage points in 10 years and bring it within shouting distance of its Paris alignment targets. And I think that's great. You know, I think if you can, so you haven't changed people's minds, you've completely changed their behaviour. So, well, I think a transition plan for me, and I know there's loads of consultants in the room, I mean, a plan is how you turn your strategy into action, right? So your strategy needs to be your North Star that doesn't change, doesn't get buffeted, can be evolved. And then your plan is how you take that, and it's what you do every day. As you say, it's something that then permeates every department and everyone's inbox, and everyone can see how they're contributing. The thing I find a little scary is we have this corporate activity, you know, all of the net zero reduction targets. There's no global reporting back mechanism for that. So I always argued at COP there should be a global, this is the bucket of corporates who've set their targets, here's the baseline, here's the delta. Look, it's not enough, but no one asks for that. So again, and by the way, NDCs, which are nationally, we're using climate alphabets, governments nationally determined contributions, their so-called plans. Some of them are very detailed, others are like the kind of thing your 12-year-old might do for homework with a bit of, probably with AI help now. And yet they're not really scrutinised. They're all added up as if they're the sort of tablets from the mound. They're not. They're governments of the time making a bunch of wish lists, knowing they're not going to be in office when they have to be implemented. Sorry to be so cynical, but there we are. It's the truth. So we need to deal with the truth. Whereas I think plans that actually say, here's the strategy, here's what government department X needs to do this year, and here's who the stakeholders they need to involve. That would be a proper plan. And I'm sure there are examples of that. I'm sure Singapore's example plan is like that.
I'd love to see, are there any questions online? Oh, Xinglu, yeah.
I have a question around the state of play around investors' role in pushing corporates to do more. Of course, there are different spectrums of responsible investing. On the one side, we have impact investing. On the other side, we have mainstream investors are now more aware of the ESG impacts. So I just want to ask, like, when you invest in a company or you have already invested in a company, what are the pre-investment due diligence? What are the things you ask company to assess whether they are performing good in terms of corporate climate actions? Or, once you invested, what are the things they need to report back to you so that you can continue to assess that? And can you give like examples of, when such investor requests come through and that cause an impact, real positive impact in terms of climate?
A question for me, right? Yes, thank you very much for the question. So the situation is very different for impact investing and other investing. So impact investing has the purpose of creating impact. So what we ask is what kind of impact you're going to be creating, and we set KPI, like what you are trying to achieve. If that more improvement of health or vulnerability people, or because CO2 emission. So we do track those numbers And there's a lot of like structure in the financial system, like sustainability linked loan, the link bond. So if they achieve a certain amount of like, KPI, they're going to get some reward. But unfortunately, those are not getting very popular because there's a extra cost that kind of reduce the like interest, and there's a lot of like work need to be associated with those, and there's a mainstream bigger part of finance, and those people, I don't know if you have ever heard of like fiduciary duty, but still the main role of those financial like institutions, still asset manager, is kind of giving back the profit to the investors or like final investors, right? So I think there's a really need for, so there's a clarification from the government of you have to also think about the ESG. So, but people are still left in the middle, like, okay, we have to check ESG, but we have to look at the ESG from the perspective of how it relates to the profit. But I think that it's still the overall situation. So like for finance, so to get financial institution, all the mainstream financial institution more serious about all these things is really look at the impact, not only ESG KPIs, like what kind of like implication like their emission have in the longer term, or like their negative social impact they are creating on people, what's kind of like what they are doing. So disclosing this to the public, and not only investor, but eventually like consumer have to be aware of like what these numbers mean. But there's also brighter side. I was talking to one of the biggest insurance company in Japan, and they said that they were not forced by anyone, but they want to start looking at the impact. And I was like, really? Are you serious? But they want to kind of, measure the impact of all their portfolio, which will take a lot of work. But they said that they want to understand what they are really doing. So it all comes from the leadership. So if they have the right leader, like they have a different view, and if you really look at the impact, you can look at the long-term like goal, right? What's the impact in the longer term? Yeah. I don't know if it answers your question.
I think speaking to the ESG and the investment, I think just the term ESG is just one. It helped the sustainability profession, 4 or 5 years ago when it became a thing of vogue, and in terms of how a company is acting, how sustainable they are for the professionals who have been sidelined in a silo department for years and years and years and never got to even see the CFO or the CEO, or we're always sort of a separate silo, and due to the financial industry sustainability is now mainstream. Everybody knows what it is, but now unfortunately the sustainability in that work has now been lumped under the ESG umbrella, environmental, social, and governance, and that term in and of itself has been politicized, and as we know, and those in the sustainability field almost like don't want to use that term ESG anymore because it has been politicized and used sort of against common sense measures that need.
What term do people use?
They're used, well, trying to distinguish between the E, environmental, that's climate, that's sustainability, that the interconnectedness of sustainability with water, people, impact, that sort of thing. The S, social, for diversity, equity, inclusion, health and safety. So breaking it down into those and not lumping it up, because whoever you speak with, if they're in the financial investment sector, or whether they're a politician, or whether they're a corporate executive, it means something different to everybody else. And that's, one of the things I've been working on is ESG sort of education or awareness at the corporate board level, because we can move things fast through investment and through corporate governance with the tone starting at the top, and there needs to be some leveling in the field that it's not a bad thing, this ESG thing. It has a bad reputation as it costs more money, why are we doing this? And so trying to level set a little bit and calm down about ESG when you see it. It's like a missile being
to get things. It's good to be talking about the
ESG missile is coming our way.
I think I saw a question leaning in from Maya. Did you want to, before I close out?
I was intrigued by the insurance story. I often wonder about the asymmetry in this world that we deal with climate change, where someone is the cause and someone else is the effect or bears the brunt of it. But interestingly, insurance is going through a moment where the payouts are record highs because of weather impact. And I wonder, they're also sitting on an incredible amount of capital because of assets under management. I wonder if they're going to be suddenly transformed to be the forefront of changing the face of investment philosophies, because it's for the first time somewhere where synchronicity comes to cause an impact.
I cannot guarantee, but I think they are one of the very, how to say, promising candidate, because they tend to invest in the longer term, right? Their portfolio asset is longer term. And as you said, their payout is kind of really getting higher. So they need a different measurement, like to think about like how can they plan in 10 years, 20 years, right? But so I think when it's come to impact investing, like insurance industry was first to get into impact investing. It's still not huge, but they are looking from different lens, and they also have to think about like people's health, like people's like kind of wellness, because sometimes they are not like how to say stock company, but they are more like mutual like company that many of the big like insurance firms are. So I think there's maybe working with insurance company might be interesting.
And if I can just build on that, I mean,
Yeah.
I think this is what's driven a lot of the regulatory frameworks, because ultimately the challenge with insurance, this is no one can value it. And it goes back to the carbon price problem, and most companies, when they do their climate disclosures, they're qualitative, and they'll say things, or they'll do their adaptation report and they'll say, ooh, we built a 20-meter seawall around a data center. That's like, great. What about the rest of your business? And so there is this lack of data that means you can't actually quantify risk at the moment, and therefore you can't get insurance against it. But I think those building blocks, would you agree, are coming together, because we are kind of going down this pathway of more precision. First of all, 20-odd% of emissions now have some form of carbon pricing, albeit it's highly variable. But we are getting the building blocks together where, in theory, you could get insurance. And then when you know the cost of this it's back to the point about, so if your business model is just we chug along and then we react when there's a carbon price, and you're actually kind of looking down the barrel of sea level rise that wipes out 90% of your customer base, or at least requires them to move, that's kind of an existential threat that but no one dares to quantify right now, and they get by not quantifying, because they say, well, we don't have the numbers. But we will get the numbers.
I agree with you. There are some foundational steps happening, and I've seen it in the private sector teaming up with academia. MIT is one organization that I'm aware of that's doing that, are taking their atmospheric climate models, working with the private sector, and using those models around looking at the climate resilience of private sector assets around the world, and from a probability standpoint, what is the rain, precipitation, that sort of thing. So the building blocks are slowly coming through, but you're right, there's just this lack of hard data right now.
I'm not a doomer, but I do always think don't look up is a sort of brilliant encapsulation of this, that we'll be watching we won't see, unless the Thwaites Glacier melts, we're not going to see, sorry to be all geographical with you, but we're not going to see dramatic sea level rises very quickly. But we are, as a species, we're really good at optimism bias, and really bad at long-term risk assessment, and so that kind of playing out right in front of us.
Well, that's exactly, I think, the essence of transition planning. It's actually forcing you to now start to think ahead about some of these changes. And I think the conversation's been really captured where we're at globally and in different places in countries and communities and companies, where there's these kind of the reality of what's happened and where, like, the crisis that we're in today, and acknowledgement of where we need to get to in the future, and those kind of forces pulling you back, the push identifying the catalysts, the insurance, the price on carbon, the different things that will really be it's not what, it's just when are we really going to hit on that downward curve peak emissions and get down on that trajectory. So I'd love to just finish with a little piece of ancient wisdom from Socrates, nonetheless. So the secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And so I'd love to hear from each of our panelists. What are you building the new in your own, what's ahead for you when you think about building the new in climate change? Anyone dare to take a first stab?
Well, I guess I'll give it a go here. I have 5 seconds to think about it. So building anew, things that I'm excited about working on as mentoring the next sort of generation of CSOs. And I've been doing it informally for a number of years, but just really trying to pass on some of the things that worked and didn't work. So working from the new talent coming in when there's so much talent there, and there's so, you know, this is a perfect example of this room here of people that really, really care. And so just trying, I want to help, you know, and say, so through the mentoring aspect, and then through private sector being the big elephant in the room that can really help move the needle quickly, and looking at corporate governance and from a board perspective. So those 2 directions, and those are kind of more newer things I'm working on, and I'm excited and make me an optimist, you know, at the end of the, I'm internal optimist anyways, and I have that human bias towards it anyways, but if not now, when? And if not us, who? You know,
That's exactly right.
End of that.
Mari-san.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I'm doing several things. Like my passion right now is, of course, impact investing, but I just don't think there's enough product out there that people can invest in Japan. So we are trying to build more funds or more product, and we are also doing consulting to really spread the thinking of like impact mindset, like not just product, but just not think about, you know, only profit, but how the impact will pay back in the longer term type of like concept will be really important, I think. So I would try to talk about that. And also, I'm doing a lot on gender, because I think there's a strong link on women and the environment, because like I think that there's interesting data coming up that how the climate change will affect different gender differently, right? So I think it's important that everybody in the society really gets their voice out, like from their perspective, from younger gen, like Z gen or gender. And in Japan, gender voice tend to be very small. So I'm trying to work with some groups to talk about more about like climate change or any social issue from a gender perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Claire, what's
It's a
your
great
building?
question. I'm busy thinking. So I think 2 things. I mean, so focusing on the old in the climate space involves trawling back over 30 years of argument. And you know, and anyone, as we talked about yesterday, you're a negotiator, you know this better than me.
Form
but,
our
you know,
neg-
former
we formed.
negotiator. So once you dive into the global climate space, you know, which you think, which is a wonderful thing we have, you realize that, you know, we're imagining a utopia where everyone agrees and politics doesn't matter, and you know, people go in with the bias for progress and agreement. And the reality is quite the opposite. So at the moment, there's a thing called the Bonn Intercessional, which is an mid-year landing sort of springboard for COP. And they couldn't agree, they couldn't negotiate the agenda. So they spent the first couple of days arguing over the agenda. Now, this is not, you know, and I am sort of done with that system, truthfully, because I think that we have done this incredible job in raising consciousness, in developing landing zones, and really doing that Overton principle thing in politics, of talking about what's the thing. But it's not working, and emissions are up 50% plus since the first COP. So fine, let people meet and argue about agendas and argue about the colour of the grayscale in the literally negotiate the colour of the grayscale in a tab and an appendix. Negotiate that with 196 parties. Like, what the hell? And let's focus on what we need to do tomorrow. And so my bias is, what are we going to do tomorrow? And I think we need to do everything everywhere all at once. And we need to try a bunch of stuff, and we need to do a ton of carbon removal. And I get that Vera has lost some of its quality, its standards, but you know, we can show you 100 projects that are sequestering carbon, empowering women and improving biodiversity right now, and people should be investing in them. So I just want to do everything for the future, and I want the future to be less about trying to define perfect and more about just doing good. You know, every single day there is an argument in the climate space about, you know, how the rate of emissions or sectoral stuff, and it's like, good Lord, this is not has anyone looked at the Keeling curve? This is not an academic problem. This is a real life problem. And we will not solve this by sitting around scratching our navels arguing, which is essentially what a lot of people do. So my focus on the future is that if I can in a tiny way galvanize people to just do stuff and slightly shut their ears to all the shouting about, and by the way, the other thing about the past is we focus on, we have a giant fossil fuel industry, of which I sit on the board of a company, for full disclosure, partly because it's doing huge amounts of carbon capture and removal. The world is completely dependent on fossil fuels today. That is a fact. We're not going to imagine that situation away. So what are we going to do tomorrow? Methane, you mentioned. There are some incredibly important low-hanging fruits that we could do that would dramatically, well, not radically reduce, actually, if we got on top of our methane. We think if we got on top of methane, it could reduce emissions by it would be equivalent of 0.5%, half a degree of warming. So let's just do that. So my focus is let's just do stuff.
Good note. I think that you're in good company in a startup. Let's do everything
Let's
all the
do
time.
everything all the time, but let's make it impactful.
Yeah, deliver impact. Thank you so much for joining us for this cafe today, and thank you also for just being on our advisory council and working with the company and providing the leadership that you do. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.